Hello and welcome to Amagi, co-hosted by myself, Nima Mahjour of economicsjunkie.com and Dylan Moore of the Volitional Science Network, which you can find on YouTube. We are here to tackle ideas both ancient and modern in an effort to bring you the tools needed to expand the power of your worldview, making you a more potent entity, professionally, politically, philosophically, or otherwise. And we are graciously being hosted by the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com. This is our third installment of our Evolution of Civilizations, Early Societies, and the Background of Civilizations. Hi, Dylan. How's it going?
Hi, Nima. I'm doing great. How are you?
Good.
Yeah. Are you interested to, or are you excited to dive back into the furthest never reaches of human history, or I should say prehistory?
Can't wait.
Yeah. Just a recap for everybody. I don't know if this is the first step that you may have fallen into for the first episode that you've listened from us, because this is step 3, or episode 3 in a series that we're doing on the evolution of civilizations. I just want to give a reminder that we're reading from and analyzing a book called Evolution of Civilizations by Carroll Quigley in an effort to apply the scientific method to historical analysis, and our goal being how to turn history into a practicable subject. And in the last episode, we covered what we're calling the 7 stages of civilization, and how a civilization's core driving force is something called an instrument of expansion, and how this instrument of expansion shapes these 7 stages. Now, what I was hoping to do in this episode 3 was to apply this life and death cycle of civilization, these 7 stages, to some actual civilizations, and it was my goal to get into Mesopotamia. Now, when I sat down to do the notes out of the book, because, like I said, we're going through this book, before Quigley gets into any particular civilization, he starts with Mesopotamia, he goes into what he terms the early matrix of civilizations, or more like the backdrop of human societies, like what humans were doing before they actually got into the civilizations. And I figured, okay, I'll just do a quick summary of this just to set the stage, and then we'll get right into Mesopotamia. And by the time I had finished with my quick summary, I had 8 pages of notes. So it looks like we're doing a whole new, or an entire episode on just the background of civilizations. And this is actually my 3rd time going through this book, Evolution of Civilizations. And the first 2 times I read it, I found this chapter somewhat boring, convoluted, and not entirely relevant to the rest of the book. What I realized now on my 3rd time through, and this is largely due to the fact that I was taking notes with the intention of mind of explaining this to somebody else and making sure that I understood and had it organized in a way that was understandable, that this information is absolutely riveting and totally central to understanding where civilizations are coming from. So I guess the problem was Quigley, who's normally brilliant in the organization of his ideas, just happened to screw this chapter up. So what I'm going to do, or what we're going to do here, is we're going to be moving from the generalized concepts that Quigley has been going over, and these are things like the instrument of expansion and the 7 stages of civilization, where we never actually delved into anything specific. And we're going to get more specific into the details of history, or I guess in this case, prehistory. And one thing I want to emphasize is the dating of this material, particularly that this book was written in 1961. So even though I can't even fathom the amount of work that Quigley had to do to put together a work like this, particularly before the internet, it was still published in 1961, which means there's been more than 60 years worth of archaeology, research, scholarship, and scientific development. Essentially the instrumentation that's needed to analyze and research archaeology is much better than it was 60 years ago. And just to emphasize this, because how important this wasn't clear to me until I actually took an instrumental analysis class in college, because I have a degree in chemistry and I was actually working with analytical instruments, and we specifically had a class called instrumental analysis. And at the beginning of the class, in order to beat it into our heads how important instrumental analysis is, our professor actually had, several examples, particularly of archaeology, of, what people are trying to figure out, what instrumentation that they're using, and why what they did or what conclusions they came to do or don't make sense. And I get this feeling that a lot of people think, particularly when it comes to chemistry, that chemists simply have machines that you could throw material into that, some white powder or organic material or whatever, and you throw it in and it tells you exactly what it is and everything what you want to know about it. And this can't be further from the truth. So one example that I remember specifically was a professor brought up that at some point in recent history, I think this is like back in the 70s, somebody claimed to have found a map in the logs of Columbus detailing the New World. And, it kind of spawned a controversy because the historical image that we have of Columbus venturing out into the New World, not knowing what he was going to find, versus a guy using a map might, tarnish his historical character a little bit. So I don't remember specifically the instrumentation involved, but the discoverers of this map had sent it to a chemist for analysis, who analyzed the ink and the ink of other documents from the era that the map was purported to be from. The chemist's results was that the ink from the map was significantly different from the ink of the documents from the suspected era, causing him to conclude that the map was a fake. Now, the story I also remember hearing in class was that the discoverers of this map ran with it anyway, and they had like a big event saying, "Oh, we discovered Columbus's map of the New World," and I guess the guy showed up outside the event with flyers detailing how the map was a fake, and specifically because he was the guy who did the research, went into all the details of how he knew exactly why it was a fake. So I just wanted to tell that story to give an example of how radically instrumental analysis is to determining, specific things that are going on, particularly within archaeology. And that, chemistry in the 50s and 60s is nothing, absolutely nothing like the chemistry that we have today. So keep in mind, as we're going over this material, that the factual components are in serious need of updating, as I'm sure much has been discovered in the last 60 years. However, despite this, the facts are going to be accurate enough to show concrete examples of Quigley's generalized ideas in play. Quigley aims criticism of archaeology at the time, that archaeologists tend to be hyper-focused on whatever they're researching, and no one is compiling metadata like he's done in this book. And I would go as far as to posit that this criticism is probably well-deserved even today in all academic subjects, because they all seem to suffer from this hyper-specialization. So, that being said, if you're an historian or an anthropologist that happened to stumble across this podcast, and specifically this episode, and you have the updates to give us, we would be very happy if you wanted to come on and do a show and a recording and let us know what's new. So, particularly now, we're going to be going through prehistory, and in the next episode, some very ancient civilizations, and the evidence is very sparse. Where we don't have evidence, Quigley likes to infer things, I guess is what you have to do, because you got to work with the evidence that you have. And one of the things that irritates me a little bit about this book, particularly with these older civilizations, is Quigley does a lot of inferring, and he kind of does it with the same authority that he presents the evidence with. So I'm going to try to emphasize what Quigley's inferences are versus his evidence. And sorry, this introduction is taking so long. We're about to get into the material. I also want to point out that Quigley, when he puts these ideas forth, does so as an introduction for further discussion, and as a proper scientist should, he right out states that these ideas are not concrete and they're not the end-all truth. Rather, he puts them forth as a hypothesis requiring further refining. So, now, as far as I can tell, and Nima, I'm guessing this is as far as you could tell as well, when Quigley wrote these ideas, he died and no one has really talked about them since. So our first goal here is to simply make them available again, and then we can have a more refined discussion of them. Do you have roughly the same feeling in your pursuits of historical knowledge?
You mean that
no one's really
that his writings
no one's compiling metadata and trying to apply the scientific method to history.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And so even though the stuff's 60 years old, we're kind of like digging it out of a time capsule and saying, hey, look, maybe we should look at this stuff again.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there are people who do have all this metadata, but they just don't share it with us. They're just secret thousands and thousands of years old archives. And it's such an important science to people who want to manipulate and control people that they keep it secret.
Yeah. And if we understand this a little bit better, we can make ourselves hopefully a little bit more immune to that manipulation. So,
yeah.
The matrix of early civilizations. So essentially what we're talking about is leading up to what we were calling stage 1 of the 7 stages of civilization in the last episode, which is mixture. And I guess to put it simply, in order for us to start at the first civilization, we need to have an idea of what peoples are mixing. And Quigley, being the genius that he was, gets into climatology, geology, paleontology, anthropology, and all sorts of other ologies, whatever ologies that he needs to explain this story. And the story starts with the first ice age about 1 million years ago. Now, this chapter is so complex, and as I mentioned before, more than likely outdated, that there's no way that I could accurately cover all the information presented in it without simply reading it. And even then, you probably wouldn't want to listen to it in audiobook form, because so much of what he describes requires you to stop and think about it for a few moments, and you're like, man, I wish I had some maps. He gives a few maps, but they kind of suck. I mean, what do you want from a book from the 60s? I wish I had some maps to help understand what's going on, because I'm having a hard time connecting this stuff. So what we're going to be doing here is giving a radically oversimplified version of what I'm considering to be the most important points of the chapter. So, for the sake of this discussion, which is the discussion that Quigley's having, we're going to be looking at the, in quotes, old world, which includes the continents Europe, Asia, and Africa, and particularly Northern Africa, as the history of the West is our focus. These are the areas that are going to be the seeds that eventually grow into the West. And so this Afro-Eurasia, as I'm calling it, in a very crude manner, can be divided into 3 distinct geographical areas. And Nima, I have sent you some pictures, and if you look at picture number 1, we have a picture of this Afro-Eurasia that I'm explaining, and these pictures will be available in the links below. And if you're watching this on my YouTube channel, I'm going to be having it available in the video. For the sake of what we're doing, we're going to be looking at these land masses kind of as a single continent. And the first thing that you'll notice, and I don't know why I've never noticed this, is Afro-Eurasia is kind of one big flat piece cut in half by one continuous string of mountain ranges. And this string of mountain ranges, Quigley is calling the Highland zone. So, I mean, if you look over in Europe, it starts in the Alps, and it runs all the way to the Himalayas. And
it even starts
for the sake of this. What's that?
A little bit. You also have some.
It does start in Spain a little bit, but I think the important part is going to be where it starts kind of, what is that, Eastern France, because of the way it blocks off the rest of Europe. We can move on to picture 2, because for the sake of our conversation, we're not really interested in the Himalayas. And so picture 2 is a little bit more zoomed in, so we can get a little bit more detail here. Now, to the north of this essentially one long continuous mountain range, we're calling the Highlands zone, is the northern flatlands. And as you can see, this begins as a narrow wedge about in Amsterdam, and it gets wider and wider and wider and wider, and essentially goes all the way to the east end of Asia, which is about 2,000 miles across. And particularly once we get to the eastern side of Europe, most of this, as far as I know in my historical study, is known as the steppe. Below the Highland zone, we have what's called the southern flatlands, and it basically does the opposite of the northern flatlands, where it starts wide in the west and gets thinner and thinner and thinner as we go east. This and it ends around the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean, and you can see it once it hits Iran there, where I never realized how much of Iran was mountains. Once it hits Iran there, yeah, it's just mountains. I forgot, Nima, you're half Iranian. Have you been to Iran?
Never been, no.
Okay, well, I was going to ask you how mountainous it was there, or how the mountains were.
Well, it's definitely, there's a lot of skiing going on there, for sure.
Really? Yeah. I had no idea. Man, we should go to Iran to go skiing. Can we go there with an American passport?
Yeah, I think you can. You just got to get a visa.
Okay. You know? Okay, there we go. So yeah, these southern flatlands essentially include North Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, the most of modern Jordan, Syria, and Iraq before you bump up into those mountains. So now, with our very crude, oversimplified view of what we're calling here the Northwest Quadrant, what I just described, where we've got these flatlands that are cut in half by these mountain ranges, there's a couple other major geographical areas that kind of break up this division, mainly inland seas. And as most people know, the most important inland sea is the Mediterranean Sea. And it is an interesting aside, which will be more important once we start talking about the other civilizations, is that these inland seas, particularly the Mediterranean, were so important because water transportation was by far more efficient and cheaper than land transportation until 1750 AD, when we start getting
trains,
modern carriages and trains and such. So what this means is that the people who lived on the shores of a sea were actually more connected with anybody else connected to those shores of the same sea, more than the people inland. So, for example, the people living in Greece or the people living in Rome were more connected to the people in Carthage than their biological cousins, the Germanic barbarians to the north. Now, even possibly more importantly, if we go to the next image, we got a zoomed in view of the Levant here. So we're looking at like Israel and Syria and Jordan and Cyprus and stuff. There are two main land bridges that connect the two sides of but basically connect everything, the north and the south and the east and the west. So the first one is called the Syrian Saddle. I'm moving to the fourth image here. I got some words and arrows and stuff written here. So if you look at the Arabian Peninsula and you look at Anatolia, I also didn't realize Turkey is covered in mountains. I don't know why. My whole life of staring at a world map, I've never realized that if you look at this, if you look at the Afro-Eurasia landscape, there's this massive mountain range that runs across the whole thing. If you're going to go across the Arabian Desert, or you're going to go across Syria, you have this massive desert to the south, and you have these huge mountains to the north. And if you're going to go across it, there's actually only one really small place, if you're going by foot, or maybe even if you have a couple camels, that you can make it, and it's called the Syrian Saddle. And if we're looking at this map that I have, and if for some reason you're listening to this on audio, try to imagine the Eastern Mediterranean. There's Egypt to the south, there's Israel and Syria to the east, and there's Turkey to the north, and there's Cyprus sitting in the middle of the sea. That in order to cross that desert, the only place to go is if you go all the way north, just underneath where you're about to head into Anatolia. There's this place where the space between the green part of the shores of the Mediterranean Sea and the Tigris River, or excuse me, the Euphrates River, is the shortest. That's the Syrian Saddle, and that's the place, apparently, which was the only place that you could cross and survive back in the day. And by back in the day, we're saying early civilization and pre-civilization. So if we go back to we zoom out on the map and we say, okay, if we're starting anywhere in the Mediterranean and we want to get down to, modern day Eastern Iraq, that's the only place to cross. That's an interesting geopolitical observation, and it occurred to me that this might be one of the reasons why this area has always been such a geopolitical hotbed, is that until, I guess, early modern times, that was the only place to cross. Yeah. Because, unless you got a boat that could go all the way around, or you have some sort of modern transportation and air conditioning and water that you could bring with you, you're not making it through the mountains, and you're not making it over the desert. And then there's a second route, which, if we go to picture 5, it's a little convoluted, and I'm sorry that I wasn't able to find maps without the names of all the cities on them. It was the best topographical map I could find, and I couldn't get the cities to turn off. So this is modern day Greece. You should be able to see that from looking at it. And to connect the northern flatlands to the Mediterranean Sea, or at least close enough to the Mediterranean Sea that we could get east, there's two rivers that go up. There's the Vardar and the Morava rivers that connect Thessaloniki to the Danube River. So people traveling along the Danube River, this was the only place to get over down to the Mediterranean Sea. So again, if we zoom out, go back to picture 2, and we say, okay, of this whole thing, the only two land bridges accessing north to south and east to west are this Syrian Saddle and this Vardar Morava route. That's kind of nuts.
Yeah,
that never it never occurred to me to think about the map like that.
Right.
Because I mean, you just look at it and you're like, hey, just drive across it, right? So back in the day, these were the only two spots, unless you had a boat that could get around, that would get you from east to west. So the story of what we're going to be telling here is essentially how these natural barriers form different peoples. So the peoples that eventually came to inhabit these different routes, we can, at this point in the story, break into roughly three categories: the people of the North Flatlands, the people of the South Flatlands, and the people of this Highland zone. And so those in the Flatlands became very warlike and patriarchal, as food production was limited by how many pasture animals could subsist off the grasslands. So essentially, this is pre-agriculture. No one's growing. Well, they'll be growing in the Highlands, but we'll get there in a second. The agricultural technology at the time can't make it into the dirt in these grasslands. And so the food limit is how quickly you could turn grass into, I guess, goats or horses or cows. And therefore, a lot of times, if you wanted to survive, you had to raid and steal from each other, which is why these people became very warlike. And so, because the violence of men was required for subsistence, men were elevated in society, which led to worship of male deities in the form of sky gods and an emphasis on honor. And there was also an emphasis on lunar cycles, because apparently, I didn't know this, but it's when you're herding, dealing with lunar cycles is easier to track your herds. I guess it helps you see at night, and it's easier to keep track of time, because you can see the changes of the moon a bit easier than you can see changes in the sun. This was the same for people both in the north and the south. The north usually had herds of horses and cattle, where the people in the south mostly had herds of antelope, camels, and asses. And if you're somewhat familiar with world history, this northern area and the people that we're describing are, the steppe people, or the steppe horse archers that are always, belching forth out of nowhere to come conquer the settled people who have writing to record what these barbarians did to them. Names that you might recognize are the Scythians, the Huns, the Seljuk Turks, the Mongols. These are all people out of these northern flatlands. And, what's also interesting is that up until the early modern age, it's a constant theme in history that there's these, people that come warlike people that come out of these places and just cause massive damage and conquer everybody. Lost my train of thought, Nima. I think that was it.
That was it on the Flatlands people, and then...
Yes, on the Flatlands people, thank you. Because the Highland ones are kind of the more interesting ones. So in the Highland zone, people were peaceful and matriarchal, and these people would follow the hilly edges of the Highland zone as it was the best place for their primitive agriculture. So now food production was limited by gardening, which I guess... You could make more food than these pastoral peoples, otherwise they'd probably be more warlike and have to fight each other for food more often. And at some point, we're inferring here, there must have been some linguistic confusion over the Earth's ability to bear plants and a woman's ability to bear children, as they both get wrapped up in the term fertility, and this led to a rise in the status of females in society. And this obsession with fertility led to the worship of female deities, the earth becoming the main deity for these people, as opposed to the moon for the warlike people. And these were known as the Neolithic garden cultures. I finally answered your question, Nima.
What was the question?
You asked me about the Neolithic garden cultures in episode 1.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
I brought them up and I said we're going to talk about them later. We're finally talking about
part one of this series, right?
Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah, in part one of this series, I think episode 10. Yes. So these Neolithic garden cultures would farm a certain area for a few years until the soil was depleted and move on. And they were a hoe culture, meaning they hadn't yet invented to plow. They had to hoe everything. And which is one of the reasons they couldn't go down into the flatlands, because they couldn't handle the grassy sod. And like I said, they probably couldn't defend themselves against the warlike flatlands people anyways. And these are the cultures that are famous for making those little female figurines with the accentuated breasts and butt. You know what I'm talking about, Nima? That they pull up out of Europe all the time?
I think I've seen them, yeah.
Yeah. I never really had any connection to these things other than, that there was a bunch of people there a long time ago, but now I see why they're relevant, because the people who made those were the first people who developed agriculture. So, I mentioned ice ages. The Quigley points out that the development of what we essentially consider to be humans coincides with the onset of Earth's ice ages. Both were roughly 1 million years ago, and apparently this is called
the Neolithic garden cultures. What time frame are we talking about?
I think estimates, and there's estimates in the book, and there's modern estimates. After 6 years of research, I think we're talking circa 10,000 years ago.
Okay.
Up till Mesopotamia.
Okay.
So, going back to the ice ages. So, over 1 million years, Earth has experienced 4 distinct ice ages. And this has had a twofold climactic effect on humans. The first is, it's easy to imagine, particularly for primitive humans that are hunter-gatherers, if we're going back farther enough that we haven't even hit these Neolithic garden cultures, they're going to be very dependent on their climate, and they're going to be very dependent on game. Now, as the ice ages, creep in and draw back, or, essentially bringing in the glaciers down from the north and bringing them back up north again, there's actually multiple climate zones. And there's, one in particular that hunter-gatherers are really able to thrive in. So as this belt is moving up and down during this, during these cycles of ice ages, so are the hunter-gatherer humans following this belt. Now, of course, it's important to point out that this is happening over geological time. The humans moving through these cycles probably weren't even aware that they were moving. Tribes probably just crept slowly over the course of generations, following game. Now, ice during ice ages doesn't just come from the Arctic caps and the Arctic cap and the Antarctic cap. They also it also comes down from the mountains. So ice is coming from up to down as well, which is sealing off any pathways over the mountains, particularly things like this Vardar-Morava route. So what's happening through these ice ages is that certain areas are being blocked off and certain passageways are being blocked off, and humans get isolated and mixed as the ice comes down, freezes certain areas, and the ice comes back and opens those areas up. And also because this habitable belt, Quigley had a specific word for it. I don't remember what it was at the time. I didn't write it down because I didn't want to go over all the climactic options that he went, just to keep it simple. So I'm just calling it this habitable belt. As this habitable belt's moving and the people are following it, this is causing like a churning of people, while simultaneously this ice is isolating them and allowing them to mix in cycle. So what happened was, this is over this million years, this is where we start to get our distinct subspecies of humans. And I guess the most, for the sake of novelty, I guess I should say, the most interesting one was the Neanderthal, who, these were the people that got stuck in the north when the ice came, and they couldn't pass over the mountain ranges, and they had to evolve enough to be able to deal with the frozen conditions and be able to hunt big game. So this was subspecies number 1 that Quigley points out, and he has 7 of them here. So the Neanderthal, big game hunters, adapted to Arctic conditions from being trapped in the frozen northern flatlands. These people would eventually mix and interbreed with other subspecies after the Ice Age thawed out. And while, what is it? We all have roughly like 2% Neanderthal in us at this point, because some genetics are still left over. But the pure breed went extinct because they weren't able to adapt to new climatic conditions. The second group of people are agglutinative speaking roundheads. I'm sorry, there wasn't a better word for this. These were the ancestors of the Ural Altaic peoples who moved eastward across Asia, such as the Mongols, Eskimos, and American Indians. The third type of people were the long-headed, inflective-speaking Proto-Indo-Europeans. These moved out from the Kyrgyz steppes, which is in Central Asia, towards Scandinavia, and they would become the Nordic type. I guess these are our Aryans of myth. The fourth people are the Highland zone Alpine people. These are an agglutinative roundhead, and they're largely extinct today or have mixed with other groups. And these people are so interesting. We're going to get more into these people later. But the only remaining modern presence of this group is the Basque in Spain and France. Have you heard of them?
Sure. Yeah. They have their own language and culture, and it has no relation to any European languages.
Yep, or because any language at all. They're the last surviving language of these people. These Highland Zone Neolithic people.
Huh.
Yeah, that's what I said. I'm like, that's cool. We're going to be talking about that more later. The fifth type, the Mediterranean type, is an inflected language longhead on the northern fringes of the southern flatlands. So I guess this is like North Africa. The sixth is the Negroid, a tall longhead resident in sub-equatorial grasslands and the edges of equatorial forests. So black people from Africa. The seventh is the Pygmy, which is a very short, yellow-skinned roundhead living in the equatorial forest itself. Quigley suggests that they are probably the oldest subspecies and therefore, strangely, the most closely related to the Neanderthal.
You know, when I hear longhead and roundhead, I have to think of Ernie and Bert from Sesame Street, just FYI.
Maybe that'll help to keep all this stuff separate. So, if we leave out the Pygmy, as in Quigley's words, they are maybe an ancient aberrant created by a sunless hot climate. And if we widen our field of geographic concern to the entire Old World hemisphere, we come to 3 Quiglic observations. And by that I mean these are 3 observations that Quigley made. The first is, the Old World linguistic patterns turn out to be quite simple. So the Old World languages. In the center, as a recent emergent from the southern flatlands, we get a core of the inflected languages of the Indo-Europeans and the Semites. So an inflected language is a language we're speaking right now. English is an inflected language. All European languages are inflected languages. And I guess all Semitic languages are inflected languages.
What's the Old World?
And this Afro-Eurasia.
Okay.
as opposed to the New World, which would be the Americas.
Okay.
An inflected language is one where grammar, syntax, and semantic features are indicated in single morphemes. So I'm not a linguistic guy either to translate that into something that everybody can understand. For example, the word am in English, like I am, is first person singular present form of the word to be. You know about person, you know about number, and you know about tense, all within the word am. If you compare this to the agglutinative speaking languages, which Quigley says dived into the Ural-Altaic of Central Asia and the Bantu of grassland Africa. These are ones, I guess Turkish is an agglutinative language where if you want to denote tense, or you want to denote number, or you want to denote person, or any of these things, you just add more stuff to the words, and none of the pieces get adjusted or refined. Like is doesn't become am or become be or become are. It just is, and if you want to add what person you're talking to, you add something else to the word is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't speak Turkish, so I don't know.
Okay. Do you speak Farsi?
I do.
At all?
But Farsi is an
Shit.
Indo-European language.
Is it inflected? Yep. Okay. Well, I guess Nima's got 3 and they're all inflected.
I think so. Yeah.
Although I guess Japanese would be agglutinative. I took Japanese. And there's no... let's not get into that conversation. I'm not going to pretend like I'm a linguist. The third type of language is an isolating language. And Quigley says, in the Far East Asia and West Africa, there are 2 blocks of isolating languages, which probably arose from the syllabic disintegration of the oldest agglutinative language. I didn't know what an isolating language was, so I went to Wikipedia. And per Wikipedia, this says, isolating languages have a very low morpheme per word ratio and no inflectional morphology whatsoever. So I'm not going to step outside of my linguistic bounds and pretend like I can adequately explain what that means. But I guess an example is like the West African Yoruba language. So to look at that again, because we got a little bit distracted, it's quickly saying the old world, this Afro-Eurasia, can really be broken down into 3 linguistic patterns. The Indo-European and Semitic languages have the same core. The Ural-Altaic language has a core of central that goes to Central Asia and into the Bantu of grassland Africa. And I guess there's this thing called this isolating languages that get pushed to the outer fringes in Africa, West Africa, and East Asia. The second observation, Quigley says that the earliest post-glacial climate period, called the Boreal, which is from 14,000 to 600 BC, was dry and cool. This depopulated the African flatlands. So I guess people are going from Africa up toward across the Sinai Peninsula into Arabia. In the subsequent period of the Atlantic climate, from 6,000 to 3,000 BC, I guess it got wetter and hotter again, there was a movement of population back into the area, chiefly from Arabia. The people who moved westward across Africa from this area are called the Hamites. In a drier period before 3000 BC, a second and larger movement of people from Arabia into Africa was made by Semite peoples. Yes, thank you. After 3000 BC. Both of these had a huge influence on the Negroid peoples of the African grasslands and on the complex mixture, emphasis on mixture, of peoples of Egypt and Ethiopia. So essentially, the point that he's making here is that this movement of people is setting the stage for Egyptian civilization. And one thing I want to mention here, again, I want to reemphasize, like, I'm going through this information at light speed. I'm skipping a lot of stuff from his book. Or particularly from this chapter. I took the most general knowledge I could that I thought was practicable. Quigley goes into a lot of details, and for example, this part about the post-glacial period from 14,000 to 6,000, and then the next one from 6,000 to 3,000 BC, that had this specific effect on these specific groups of people. He's got a lot of that going on. So if you want to learn a lot of details about these people movements, and again, if you're like an anthropologist that knows a lot of detail about these people movements, who has updates and wants to come on and talk to us about it, that would be awesome. But yeah, I just wanted to emphasize skipping a lot of detail. Oh, and that there's a lot of these little climate movements that are moving people around. So I focus mostly on how the ice ages are really driving people to move to different locations. There's also these smaller climate shifts that, for example, maybe got a little bit drier and cooler.
Are you suggesting that there was climate change before people were driving around in SUVs?
No, they had SUVs back then.
Okay, gotcha, good.
This is totally from the fossil fuels they were burning in 14,000 BC.
Thought so.
Totally caused the climate change.
So. Okay.
Yeah, so glad we got that cleared up. So, yeah, there's smaller climactic events that moved people around in a similar way that the actual ice ages themselves did, and I'm not focusing on them a lot here, but I want to emphasize that they were there, and they were important enough to do things like set the stage for Egyptian civilization by mixing the proper peoples in the proper spot. So the third of our Quigley observations is regarding the now linguistically extinct, minus the Basque group, which is these agglutinative roundheads, or easier to remember, the Alpine peoples of the Highlands zone. And Quigley says these people typically get thrown under the bus of history due to their linguistic extinction from Indo-European invaders. And Quigley points out that this is folly, as these are the most important group of humans that have ever existed. These people were the Neolithic garden cultures, and they developed agriculture as we know it today, using the same crops and the same domestic animals that we use today. They invented metallurgy, copper, bronze, and possibly iron, and they were the first founders of civilization in the Valley of Mesopotamia.
That we know of.
Now, they mixed with somebody else, but they were the ones that brought the agriculture there. And the agriculture's key to get to, I guess, any civilization, but particularly to get these ancient civilizations kick-started. And it just blows my mind. I really knew nothing about all these people movements. Don't confuse me for someone who's any sort of expert on this subject. I'm really regurgitating information out of this book, and I'm kind of learning it as you guys are learning it right now. I never knew about the people movements, particularly in Europe, because I'm European. I mean, ethnically, I'm American. That the Basque, because I'd heard about these people called the Basque, and everyone was like, well, I don't know where they came from. Well, because they don't have anything to do with any of the Indo-Europeans. They're the only linguistic remains of the most important group of humans that ever existed, per our Quigley definition.
So they were on that.
I don't have
that mountain stretch in the middle that we looked at earlier.
Yeah, and in fact, they're on those mountains that you pointed out to me that I missed at the beginning. And what are they? They're not the Pyrenees, are they? The ones
Spain.
that separate Spain from France.
Yeah, that's probably why the Basques are in Spain now, huh?
Yeah. What I was watching videos about them today because it got me interested in it. They're actually kind of like 2/3 in Spain and 1/3 in France. So, how many minutes are we in this thing? Oh, we're about an hour. Okay. So, that's about as far as I'm going to be taking it this episode. And I'm going to step back in fear of overdoing it, because Quigley starts getting into Bronze Age, specific Bronze Age and specific Iron Age invaders, and more nuance on how the climate changed, and it made these people go over here, and it made them fight with these people, and they took over this trade route, and these people settled here and took over those people. I'm leaving all that out. He's setting up the specifics of the backdrop of peoples and their cultures for the mixing points of the original civilizations. It's fascinating material, and I definitely recommend reading it. And again, it'd be great if someone could give us, modern updates. But for the scope of what we're doing here in this series, this is enough. When we start to go over specific civilizations in later episodes, we're going to be zooming in and looking at more of a microcosm of the people involved in each civilization. For example, once we talk about Mesopotamia, we'll talk about what specific Highland peoples mixed with what specific peoples there, or our best guesses as to who they were. And that's why this chapter, this episode was important, because now you'll understand roughly what types of peoples were available and what were the things that were causing them to bump into each other. And at least when I read this material, the image, the growing and receding ice of the glacial ages gave me, as well as these more minor climactic shifts, were like geological pistons, which were grinding and splitting groups of peoples apart, causing them to isolate and mix in these, cyclical eras that are laying the groundwork for these civilizations. And for me in particular, of European descent, I've never really thought about, what sort of people mixing determined who I was. And it's one of the reasons I find this alpine peoples of the Highlands so fascinating, because I've heard vaguely. I was never really paying attention because I was never that interested about, there was people in Europe at one point, and then these European peoples came from somewhere. I wasn't even paying attention to where, and they killed all those people, and then the Indo-Europeans were left over. That's who we are. But it's more like we're a mix. Even though we're speaking the Indo-European languages, we're a mix of the people who were here before and the people who invaded, and it was the people who were here before that laid the groundwork for this whole topic, this whole development of civilizations. So, at least for me, I was kind of in awe and felt this I don't know a better way to say it, deep connection with my ancestors from reading this material. How did you feel hearing this?
Well, I mean, yeah, it's very important because it's what happened before. What we're told is the dawn of civilization. So how did we get there? How did the earliest civilizations emerge? And how did the mixture occur? Those are important questions. So it's very interesting. And also, I'm wondering, because you said these Highlands people were the ones who invented a lot of these methods that defined Western or whatever, actually, or any civilization.
All of it.
And they were from the Highlands. So I wonder, were they like living in mountainous caves? Were they sort of is that what the cavemen? Is that the same thing as, or something like the cavemen who lived in caves? And there's also
I don't know.
There's a word that it's troglodyte. I don't know if you've heard of that. A cave dweller, basically. And I've actually recently heard some stories on Alan Watts' podcast about ancient mythologies about these cave dwellers or mountain dwellers who would, during disasters, who would disappear into the mountains and survive in the mountains on their own for like centuries or even longer, and then come back, descend down from the mountains, and start off a new civilization, introducing and sort of mix with the population and introduce methods of civilization and of population control, such as money and hierarchies and military control, etc. So I'm wondering,
man, that's almost the same story I just said.
There's sort of some overlap between these two things. Basically, I could be completely wrong, but it just the similarities just sounded very convincing to me just now, and I just have to look up some of these older stories again and read up a little bit more on it. But apparently, there's a lot of ancient civilizations that have old mythologies about people who lived in the mountains or who came down from the mountains, high priesthoods who sort of semi-mixed with the people, but also remained secretive. And maybe even, maybe those are even the people who have retained a lot of knowledge from previous civilizations that we're completely unaware of. We don't.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point to bring up too when we're going over all this. Is we don't know the whole story at all of what was going on in ancient times. The only story that we know are the things that are dug up, and I mean, from what I understand, there's stuff being dug up all the time where people are like, I don't know where this fits in. Also, particularly the megalithic structures that are like, they find like pyramids underwater near Okinawa, and then people are like,
exactly. There's so much that we know that the people back in those days, even the Egyptians, they knew way more than we think they do. I think you can say that with high certainty, because we have no explanation how they built these incredibly precise structures with unevenly carved rocks that were perfectly fitting together. I mean, it's absolutely
carved with copper tools.
Yeah, I mean, we don't even know. I mean, but just look at some of these giant rocks and how they're put together without concrete, and they're pretty unevenly carved. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but I just watched a documentary on YouTube about it. That's why I'm talking about it. It's called The Revelation of the Pyramids. But anyway, there's just and in that documentary, they also go through some mainstream archaeologist statements, and it's always, whenever there's things that they can't explain, they just imagine it's not relevant. It's like, oh my god, okay, they had the perfect geometric correlations, and they had the number phi and the number pi in it, and they had these perfectly carved rocks, and they must have had measuring tools that are even better than we have today in order to come up with these incredibly precise geometries. But it's all just a coincidence, so let's just move on and forget about that. But yeah, I mean, there's just so much that we don't know that's very important to point out, I think.
Yep, I agree. And as you say that, I said this at the beginning, and I want to say it again, is that with the story we're given here, it's kind of, I mean, it's like with science. And we talked about this, I think, in the first episode of the series, that there's no final explanation of science. It's always being retested, and the scientific method is always being applied to develop people's scientific view of the universe. And I think the same thing can be applied of the historical view of the world, where, we have a certain historical view. Like, for example, we're going over these particular movements of people, and then there's these certain civilizations, and then this civilization had this effect, and it made that civilization. And there may have been like an extra civilization that was affecting that we had no idea about, and we just don't know. And you could look at it and say, well, you don't know the whole story, so your story it isn't valuable. well, if that's true, it's equally applicable to the natural sciences, which obviously that's not the case. And I think the important point is that we draw out the principles, or I'll even say universal principles that we can from analyzing the material that we have. And in this case, the big one that Quigley has pulled out is, instruments versus institutions, and specifically instruments of expansion versus institutions of expansion. So I find it fascinating too when we have these instruments, I should say. It's Quigley's instruments versus institutions, because when we were talking about it, I immediately was able to apply it just to my own life and my own observations with organizations that I've seen. And so even if the historical story isn't entirely accurate, or some of the facts aren't right, or some of the facts aren't put together the right way because we don't have the modern science to tell us how to put them together the right way, these historical principles are still powerful. And they'll still help us explain what's going on today. And furthermore, Nima, you brought up a point of why understanding where the stuff came from helps us understand today. It's even stronger than that, where the things that people were doing back in these times, we're still doing it today. For example, we're still using the same crops and domestic animals that these Neolithic garden cultures.
We still have a money system. We still have high priesthoods. Back then there were priests. Today they're the corporate media. Society-wise, we haven't evolved much. We have better technology, maybe, and things like that. But our knowledge of history and of human psyche and mass psychology, they knew those things back then. They knew those things thousands of years ago, and they still know those things, but they don't release the information. They keep it secret, because that's what you need to do if you want to control people and herd people around like animals. And so that's another reason why it's helpful to know these things, because it's a tool of intellectual self-defense.
It's the same patterns. Yeah. Oh, yeah. There you go. So I was going to end this out by reading the last paragraph of this chapter out of the book, because I think it ties it up nicely. Did you have anything else you wanted to
go for
throw in there before I do that? Okay. So this is page 207 of the Evolution of Civilizations, last paragraph of the chapter. The events described in this chapter, performed on the three-zoned northwest quadrant within a chronology based on climate changes, form the matrix in which the earliest civilizations evolved. These events, examined in detail with careful attention to brief periods or to small areas, probably seem very confused. But organized in terms of a whole history of the quadrant during the Quaternary Age, remember that Quaternary Age is the last billion years of ice ages, as we have tried to do, these events begin to assume a relatively simple patterns. During the Pleistocene period, there came into existence the triple-layered linguistic and physical pattern that we have described. During the Holocene, and the Holocene is the time after the last ice age, so I guess we're still in the Holocene right now. During the Holocene, this pattern was somewhat complicated, but the chief event was the invention of agriculture, metallurgy, and civilized living by the Highland zone peoples, and the subsequent linguistic and cultural submergence of these peoples by inflective-speaking long-headed pastoralists, pushed in waves from the flatlands by the two post-glacial dry periods. One of the chief results of this process, a result seen perhaps most clearly in Europe, was to create a political and social structure in which patriarchal, warlike, horse-loving, sky-worshipping, honor-seeking Indo-Europeans were established as a ruling class over peaceful, earth-loving, fertility-dominated, female-oriented peasant peoples. This pattern, first established in Central Europe almost 4,000 years ago, was not destroyed in spite of Rome, Christianity, and later migrations until the appearance of industrialized urban society in the last 4 generations.
Well, and I would like to add, this pattern is also a rough outline of the political spectrum, which is left versus right, or female versus male, or pity for weakness versus admiration of strength. I mean, this is a continuum.
It was right there.
There's a continuum that reoccurs throughout history, and that's why I guess maybe it's a meta fact of history. That's why we're talking about it.
Yep. And then before you close us out, Nima, I just wanted to say, so I said last episode that we're going to be doing Mesopotamia on this episode, and I explained earlier why we're not. Next episode, we're doing Mesopotamia, so look forward to that.
Look forward to that. And with that, this has been Amagi, hosted by myself, Nima Mahjour, of economicsjunkie.com, and Dylan Moore of the Volitional Science Network, which you can find on YouTube. And we are, of course, graciously being hosted by the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com. Leave us your comments, and we will see you next time.